music stopped before anyone decided to stop it. Red cups froze halfway to mouths. A boy in fighting gloves stood chest to chest with a man twice his age, finger jabbing the air an inch from his face, screaming for everyone to hear that he wasn't scared of some nobody handyman. Dean Kincaid didn't step back, didn't raise his hands. The punch came fast, aimed to humiliate, not just to hurt. Dean tilted his head half an inch. The fist passed his ear like wind through a door left open. Somewhere behind the grill, a man's proud smile froze in place. 3 weeks earlier, Franklin, Tennessee looked like nothing was wrong with it at all. Magnolia trees leaned over quiet streets, and the town square still smelled like fresh coffee every morning before the tourists arrived. Dean Kincaid's house sat at the end of Larkspur Lane, a one-story rambler with a porch that needed paint he never had time to buy. He ran a small repair and landscaping outfit, the kind of business that fixed fences and unclogged gutters, and never made the local business journal. Nobody in town knew what he used to be. He preferred it that way. His daughter, Daisy, was 8, all elbows and freckles. Always one question behind the last one she'd asked. Since her mother died 4 years earlier, it had been the two of them figuring out mornings together, packing lunches with notes drawn on napkins, learning which of Daisy's stuffed animals needed to sit where at bedtime. Dean's hands, calloused from work that had nothing to do with what they used to do, were gentle with her in a way that made the loss of his wife feel, some days, almost survivable. 2 doors down, past the low hedge that marked where ordinary Franklin ended, the Bradford estate began. Wrought iron gates, a lawn cut in stripes, a pool house bigger than most homes on Larkspur Lane. Nathaniel Bradford had built half the new construction in Williamson County and made sure everyone remembered it, especially at homeowners association meetings, where he presided like a man born to hold a gavel. The moving truck arrived on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, a maple branch, weakened by a storm the week before, had come down across the shared fence line between the new house and Dean's. He was already out there with a chainsaw when the front door opened and a woman in scrubs stepped onto the porch, arms crossed against the morning chill. "That's my fence, too," she said, not unkindly, just precise, the way people talk when they've spent a career giving instructions that need to be followed exactly once. "Then I guess we're neighbors," Dean said, and went back to cutting. Her name was Harper Prescott. She'd just taken over as chief of emergency medicine at Williamson Regional, though Dean wouldn't learn that for weeks. To him, she was simply the new doctor. To her, he was the guy who fixed the fence without being asked twice, quiet in a way that made her curious despite herself, and then annoyed at her own curiosity. By Saturday, the fence was mended, and Daisy had appointed herself supervisor of the operation, dragging the garden hose across the yard to water a row of tomato plants that didn't need watering yet. She waved at Harper over the fence with the easy confidence of a kid who hadn't learned yet that adults could be strangers to each other. "Your daughter's going to run this neighborhood someday," Harper said, allowing herself a small smile. "She's already running my house," Dean said. "I just live here." Daisy laughed loud enough that a bird startled out of the hedge, and for a second the space between the 2 yards didn't feel like a boundary at all. The invitation came the following week, hand-delivered by Nathaniel Bradford himself, all white teeth and firm handshake, insisting the whole street come celebrate the 4th of July at his place burgers, fireworks. "A chance," he said, looking Dean up and down, "for everybody to get to know each other properly." Dean folded the card into his back pocket and didn't think much more about it. He had no way of knowing that in 3 weeks, that lawn would be the place where every quiet thing about him almost came undone. The park off Fair Street had a splash pad that ran on weekends, and Daisy had been begging to go for a week straight. Dean brought a folding chair and a paperback he never opened, watching her chase water arcs with a group of kids from her class. That was where Russ Furland found him, off duty, in jeans and a faded Titans shirt, carrying 2 coffees he hadn't been asked for. "Figured you'd be here," Russ said, handing one over. "Daisy still winning every race?" "Every one she starts," Dean said. They'd known each other 11 years, since before Franklin, since before either of them wore anything as ordinary as a badge or a tool belt. Russ was the only person in town who understood exactly what Dean used to carry, and exactly why he'd set it down. Their conversation stayed light, easy, the kind 2 old friends could have without needing to explain themselves. An older man on the next bench, gray-bearded, a faded eagle tattoo on his forearm, watched the exchange longer than casual interest would explain. When Russ straightened up out of habit to shake Dean's hand goodbye, some old muscle memory pulled his spine a half-inch straighter than a normal handshake required. The old man leaned toward his friend beside him, voice low. "See that?" he said, nodding at Dean's wrist, where a faded mark showed just below his sleeve when he reached for his coffee. "That's not just ink. That's a team leader's mark. I served with men who wore something close to that." His friend squinted. "You sure?" "I'm sure enough," the old man said. "Man like that doesn't talk about it. That's how you know it's real. I saw men come home from that world and spend the rest of their lives pretending they'd only ever driven a desk. Nobody pretends that hard unless there's something worth hiding." "Why hide it, though?" the friend asked. "Man's got nothing to be ashamed of, sounds like." "Not shame," the old man said, watching Dean fold Daisy's towel with careful hands. "Some men just don't want the weight of it following them home. Once people know, they look at you different. They want stories. They want you to be something, instead of just letting you be somebody's dad at a splash pad on a Tuesday." Dean heard none of it directly, but something in the air shifted, the particular quiet of being seen by someone who knew what they were looking at. He didn't turn. He gathered Daisy's towel, called her name twice, and walked toward the car without looking back at the bench. From across the park, seated at a picnic table with a colleague from the hospital, Harper watched the small exchange without hearing a word of it. She saw the old veteran's face change, saw Dean's shoulders go still for exactly 1 second before he moved on as if nothing had happened. She couldn't have said what she'd witnessed, only that it didn't match the man who fixed her fence without being asked twice. "You know your neighbor?" her colleague asked, following her gaze. "Not really," Harper said. "Not yet." She told herself it didn't matter. She had a 12-hour shift starting in 2 hours, a townhouse still half unpacked, and no room in her life for wondering about a man who mowed lawns for a living and apparently made old soldiers stand up straighter. She told herself that twice more on the drive home, which was usually a sign she didn't believe it the first time. At a red light on Columbia Avenue, she caught herself replaying the old man's face, the particular way his posture had shifted, respect rearranging itself into something closer to reverence. She'd spent her career reading rooms for the truth underneath what people said out loud, and every instinct she had told her that whatever Dean Kincaid carried, he carried it the way people carry things they've decided not to set down in front of anyone, least of all a stranger with a fence line in common. The letter arrived on Bradford Estates' letterhead, which seemed excessive for a homeowners association notice, but Nathaniel Bradford did nothing that didn't announce itself. It cited Section 4, Subsection 2, of a fencing code Dean had never heard read aloud at any meeting he'd attended, and it gave him 30 days to bring his property into compliance, or face a fine that would have covered 2 months of his mortgage. Dean read it twice at the kitchen table while Daisy colored beside him, then folded it and set it under the sugar bowl, the way he filed most things he didn't yet have an answer for. Colt Bradford had taken to finding reasons to be near Dean's truck. He'd lean against the tailgate at the hardware store, arms crossed, offering commentary Dean hadn't asked for. 1998 Ford, Colt said one afternoon, circling the truck like he was appraising livestock. "My dad's got cars worth more than your whole yard." "Probably does," Dean said, loading mulch bags without looking up. "Must be tough," Colt said, "doing this kind of work. With your hands and all." "Keeps them steady," Dean said, and that was the whole exchange. But Colt's jaw tightened like he'd wanted more of a reaction and hadn't gotten one. At home, in front of Daisy, none of it touched Dean's face. He made her grilled cheese cut into triangles, helped her practice spelling words for a test she didn't have yet, laughed at a joke she'd clearly rehearsed for maximum effect. It was only after her door closed for the night that he walked out to the garage, sat on an overturned bucket in the dark, and let his hands close into fists against his knees, holding there, releasing, holding again, an old exercise from a life he didn't talk about, meant for exactly this kind of pressure. The grocery store confrontation happened on a Thursday. Bradford, buying wine for a dinner party, spotted Dean in the checkout line and decided the public setting was an invitation. 30 days is generous, Bradford said, loud enough for the cashier and 3 other customers to hear. Some people around here don't seem to understand what it means to maintain property values. Dean set his items on the belt, said nothing, which seemed to irritate Bradford more than any argument would have. "I'm talking to you," Bradford said. "I heard you," Dean said. It was Harper, 2 carts back, who stepped forward, her voice even but carrying an authority that came from years of telling frightened families difficult things in calm tones. "Mr. Bradford," she said, "there are people in this line who'd like to check out sometime today." Bradford turned, recalculated who he was performing for, and let it go with a tight smile. Dean glanced at Harper for the first time that wasn't across a fence line. "Thanks," he said. "Wasn't for you," Harper said, though the small curve at the corner of her mouth suggested otherwise. "I just hate a scene in a checkout line." They talked longer than either had planned, standing by the cart return, about nothing important: the town's terrible cell reception, a good pediatrician, whether the new coffee place downtown was overpriced. Neither one mentioned what they actually did for a living beyond the labels each already carried. He was the fence guy, she was the doctor. Neither reached for more than that, not yet, though something in the conversation lingered longer than either expected once they'd driven their separate ways home. "He does this," Harper said finally, nodding faintly toward Bradford's retreating back. "Picks a person and decides they're beneath explaining himself to. Long as it stays words," Dean said, "I can live with it." "And if it doesn't stay words?" Harper asked, studying him for a beat longer than the question required. "Then it won't be a problem for very long," Dean said, and something in the flatness of his tone made Harper look at him twice, though she couldn't have said exactly why. The call came into the school office at 2:17 in the afternoon. Daisy had gone down hard on the blacktop during recess, favoring her wrist, tears streaking a face trying very hard to be brave about it. By the time Dean reached Williamson Regional's emergency entrance, his shirt was still dusted with mulch from the job he'd left mid-delivery. He found her in Bay 4, and found Harper there too, kneeling at the exam table's height, examining Daisy's wrist with a gentleness that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with the particular voice adults use for scared children. "Hey there, tough one," Harper said, not looking up from the wrist. "Your dad tells me you can do a cartwheel. Is that true? Or is he exaggerating?" "I can do 2 in a row," Daisy said, wincing as Harper rotated her hand slightly. "2 in a row is very impressive," Harper said. "This is just a sprain, not a break. You'll be back to cartwheeling in no time, but we're going to wrap it up nice and snug for a few days." Dean stood by the curtain, watching the way Harper's hands worked, unhurried even under a full waiting room's worth of pressure outside the bay, and something in his chest loosened that had been tight since the phone call. "Thank you," he said, once Daisy had been settled with a purple splint and a sticker she'd chosen with great deliberation. "Just doing my job," Harper said, though there'd been more warmth in the last 20 minutes than most shifts offered her. They ended up in the waiting room together, after discharge paperwork, Daisy asleep against Dean's shoulder, worn out from adrenaline and tears. Harper sat across from them on a break, coffee gone cold in her hand. "She's a good kid," Harper said. "Takes after her mother," Dean said. It was the most he'd offered about his past life to anyone outside Russ Furland in longer than he could remember. Harper didn't push. She just nodded, letting the silence hold what it needed to. "You're good with her too," Harper said. "Not everyone manages that alone." "Some days I manage better than others," Dean admitted, and it surprised him how easy the words came out, sitting there under fluorescent light, with a doctor he'd known less than a month. Neither of them mentioned careers beyond what the day had already shown: a doctor doing her job, a father doing his. The rest stayed folded away, the way most true things about both of them tended to. "You handled that well," Dean said, nodding toward the discharge paperwork. "The waiting, I mean. Most kids I know would have cried through the whole thing." "Most kids do," Harper said. "Daisy's tougher than most. Gets that from somewhere, I imagine." "Her mother," Dean said, quiet, the words carrying more weight than their length suggested. "She was the tough one in our house." Harper didn't ask the follow-up question, sitting right there, the obvious one about what had happened. When, how long ago? She let it sit instead, the way she'd learned to let grief breathe in a room before deciding whether it wanted company. Dean noticed the restraint, and something in him softened toward her for it. A small thing, barely visible, but real. Bradford called that same evening, while Daisy slept off the day's excitement. His voice clipped through the phone. 30 days means 30 days, Kincaid. I'd hate for this to become something formal." Dean looked at the purple splint drying on the counter where Daisy had left it, at the sticker still stuck crooked to her sleeve, and felt the full, absurd distance between what actually mattered in his life and what Nathaniel Bradford had decided mattered in his. "Understood," Dean said, and hung up before the conversation could stretch any longer than it needed to. Bradford called it a neighborhood sports social, printed on cardstock invitations that made a backyard cookout sound like a charity gala. Cornhole boards lined one side of the lawn, a taekwondo demonstration area roped off on the other, complete with breaking boards and a banner reading Bradford Family Martial Arts Academy, a business Nathaniel had bankrolled specifically so Colt could wear the title of instructor before he'd finished high school. Dean had no interest in attending, but Daisy had heard there'd be a bounce house and a face painter, and there was no argument sturdy enough to survive that combination. So they went, Dean in a plain green shirt, hands in his pockets, Daisy running ahead toward the games the moment they crossed onto Bradford's lawn. Harper arrived not long after, drawn by the same neighborhood pull that made attendance feel less like a choice and more like an obligation nobody had actually agreed to. She found Dean near the drink table, watching Daisy get her face painted like a butterfly, and stood beside him without needing an invitation. "Quite a production," she said, nodding toward the banner. "Bradford doesn't do small," Dean said. Colt found them 20 minutes later, freshly showered from his demonstration, still riding the applause. He planted himself in front of Dean with the particular swagger of someone who'd been told his whole life that confidence and skill were the same thing. "You ever train?" Colt asked, loud enough to draw a few glances. "Or is fixing gutters more your speed?" "Gutters mostly," Dean said. "Figured," Colt said. "My dad says men who don't know how to fight usually talk about how peaceful they are instead." "Your dad says a lot of things," Dean said, voice level, and walked toward Daisy's face-painting line before the exchange could go further, leaving Colt standing there with an audience that had already started drifting away, bored by a fight that hadn't happened. Nathaniel watched the whole thing from the demonstration area, arms crossed, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face at the anticlimax of it. He'd hoped for something more decisive, a moment his son could point to later as proof of something. Instead, he'd gotten a man in a green shirt walking calmly away, and somehow that irritated him more than any shouting match would have. "He's all talk," Bradford said to a cluster of neighbors near the cooler, loud enough to carry. "These quiet types usually are." Nobody around him agreed out loud, though a few exchanged glances that suggested they weren't so sure. From the edge of the yard, near the cooler, Russ Furland watched the whole exchange, jaw tight, coffee forgotten in his hand. He knew exactly how many ways that conversation could have ended differently, and exactly how much control it had taken Dean not to let it. He also knew he couldn't say a word about why, not without breaking promises made a long time ago in places far from Franklin, Tennessee. "You all right?" Harper asked, catching up to Dean by the games. "Fine," Dean said, watching Daisy laugh at something the face painter said. "Just fine." But Harper had spent a career reading the difference between fine and the performance of fine, and she filed the moment away without comment, the way she'd been filing small things about her neighbor for weeks now, unsure yet what any of it added up to. Maya Delgado had been writing for the Franklin Veterans Courier for barely 6 months, mostly obituaries and Memorial Day features. Nobody read outside of families involved. Her editor wanted a piece on quiet heroes for the upcoming issue, and someone had suggested Deputy Chief Russ Furland as a source, given his own record and his connections around the department. They met at a diner off Main Street, recorder between them on the table. Maya asked about deployments, about medals, about the transition from military to civilian law enforcement, the usual questions for the usual profile. Russ answered carefully, the way men trained to answer carefully always did. "You ever serve with anyone interesting?" Maya asked, more out of habit than expectation. Russ hesitated, just long enough. "I served with plenty of interesting people," he said. "Best team leader I ever worked under wasn't even the loudest guy in the room. Guy called K, ran a hostage extraction that never made the papers because it wasn't supposed to. Saved 11 people in country nobody back home could point to on a map." "K," Maya repeated, pen already moving. "That's it? Just a letter?" "That's classified enough as it is," Russ said, catching himself, waving it off. "Forget I said anything. Old habit, talking about the good ones." But Maya was young and hungry, and good at her job in exactly the way that made careful men nervous in hindsight. A week of digging through unclassified after-action summaries, And a veterans forum thread led her to a grainy group photo from an old joint operations newsletter, faces mostly blacked out except for a caption crediting team leader D. Kincaid with the extraction's success. The photo was 10 years old. The face in it, younger, harder around the eyes, was unmistakably the man who fixed fences on Larkspur Lane. She hadn't published anything yet, just drafted a rough outline she shared with her editor over the office group chat, the kind of internal message that has a way of traveling faster than anyone intends. By evening, it had reached 3 people who lived on Larkspur Lane, then a 4th, who happened to sit on the Homeowners Association board with Nathaniel Bradford. Bradford read the message twice at his desk, the photo attached, the caption glowing on his screen like something he couldn't unsee. His first feeling wasn't shame, it was something colder, the recognition that the man he'd spent a month trying to humiliate had, at some point in his life, held more authority in one hand than Bradford held in his entire real estate portfolio. Across town, Harper's phone buzzed with the same forwarded screenshot from a colleague who knew she lived near the man in question. She read it standing in her kitchen, the photo small on her screen, and found herself walking to the window that faced Dean's house, lights on in the kitchen, his shape moving past it once, twice, doing something as ordinary as washing dishes. She didn't know yet what to do with what she'd just learned, only that the quiet man across the fence line had been carrying something enormous the whole time she'd known him, and had never once let it show. She thought about every small moment that suddenly made sense in a different light: the stillness at the sports social, the way his eyes tracked exits in any room before he sat down, the calm that never once cracked, no matter how hard Bradford or Colt pushed. None of it had ever registered as strange, only as steady. Now she understood steady had a cost, one Dean had been paying quietly for years before she'd ever met him. She didn't text him. She didn't call. She simply stood at the window a while longer, watching the light in his kitchen, and let the new knowledge settle somewhere it wouldn't need to be spoken aloud until he was ready to speak it himself. The fireworks started a little after 9. A private show Bradford had hired for the tail end of a smaller gathering, unlicensed and closer to the tree line than any permit would have allowed. Nobody noticed the drifting spark that landed in the dry grass along the estate's back fence until the smell of smoke reached the patio. By the time the first flame caught properly, 3 teenagers, Colt among them, had gone back there chasing a dropped phone, and found the gate along the property's rear boundary locked, a padlock Bradford had installed himself after a break-in scare that spring, key nowhere close at hand. Smoke thickened fast in the dry summer grass, panic outrunning the fire itself. Dean was 2 houses down, walking Daisy home from the display, when he heard it, the particular pitch of a scream that isn't performance. He didn't think, he moved, telling Daisy in a voice that brooked no argument to stay exactly where she stood, then covered the distance to the fence line faster than anyone watching could quite explain afterward. He found the padlock, assessed it in half a second, and used a fence post lever with a technique that had nothing to do with landscaping work, snapping the hasp clean. He went through the gate low, counting heads, directing the 2 younger kids out first, voice flat and commanding in a way none of them had heard from him before, the kind of voice that gets obeyed without anyone deciding to obey it. "On your feet, straight line, follow my hand," he said. And they did, coughing, eyes streaming, moving exactly where he pointed. Colt was last, disoriented, favoring an ankle he'd twisted stumbling backward from the flames. Dean got an arm under him, hauled him upright, and walked him out through smoke thinning behind them as the fire department's first truck rounded the corner, lights sweeping the yard. Harper had been at the display too, and reached the scene with the reflexes of someone who'd spent a career running toward emergencies rather than away from them. She met Dean at the fence with a first aid kit from her car, and the 2 of them worked over Colt's ankle and the younger kid's minor burns with a coordination that needed no discussion, her hands and his moving in a rhythm neither had planned but both understood instantly, like something rehearsed long before they'd ever met. "Pressure here," she said, and his hand was already there before she finished the sentence. "Elevate," he said, and she'd already started lifting. When it was over, Colt sat wrapped in a blanket on the curb, staring at Dean with an expression that had nothing left of the boy who'd swung a fist at a 4th of July barbecue. It was something closer to disbelief, and underneath that, something that looked a great deal like shame. "You didn't have to come back for me," Colt said quietly, voice raw from smoke. Wasn't a decision, Dean said. Just what happens. Colt didn't have an answer for that. He just nodded, looking down at his hands, and for the first time all summer, said nothing else at all. Nathaniel Bradford arrived moments later, pushing through the small crowd of neighbors gathered along the curb, face gone pale at the sight of the fire trucks and his son wrapped in a blanket. He looked at Colt, then at the singed fence line, then at Dean standing a few feet away, soot on his forearms, saying nothing. You went in there, Bradford said, disbelief coloring his voice. For him, after everything, wasn't about everything, Dean said. Was about a locked gate and 3 kids who couldn't get out. Bradford opened his mouth, closed it again, and for the first time all summer had absolutely nothing to say. The Homeowners Association called an emergency session 2 nights later, folding chairs crammed into the clubhouse meeting room, every seat filled and half the block standing along the back wall. Nathaniel Bradford took the podium first, already reframing the story before anyone else could shape it. This incident, he said, raises serious questions about fencing integrity on adjoining properties. Questions I raised weeks ago that certain residents chose to ignore. A murmur ran through the room. Not quite agreement, not quite anything yet. Dean sat near the back with Daisy asleep against his shoulder, having promised her 10 more minutes before bed. He hadn't planned to speak, he hadn't planned to be there at all. Until Russ had called and told him he ought to be. Colt stood up before Bradford finished his sentence, ankle still wrapped, cutting his father off in front of 40 neighbors, in a way that visibly stunned the man behind the podium. That's not what happened, Colt said, voice shaking but clear. The gate was locked. Dad locked it himself after the break-in, and never told anyone where the spare key went. Dean broke it open. He got Marco and Ellie out first, then came back for me. If he hadn't, I don't know what would have happened. He looked at his father, then at Dean, then back at the room. I challenged him at your party because I wanted you to be proud of me. I was wrong to do that. I'm sorry, Mr. Kincaid. The room went silent in a way that had weight to it. Bradford's mouth opened, searching for a redirect that didn't exist, and what came out instead was worse than silence. I only arranged that sports social to teach the boy some humility, Bradford said, realizing too late the words were audible to the entire room. I didn't think anyone would actually get hurt. He stopped himself a full sentence too late. The room's mood shifted visibly. Neighbors who'd nodded along with him for years now exchanging glances that had nothing friendly left in them. The board chair, a retired schoolteacher named Grace Whitfield who'd tolerated Bradford's dominance of every meeting for 3 years, cleared her throat. I move we hold an immediate vote of no confidence in the current HOA president. The vote came back 9 in favor, 1 abstaining, none opposed. Bradford stood there gripping the podium's edge, the gavel he'd wielded for years suddenly a foreign object in his hand. Dean never said a word through any of it. He sat with Daisy's weight against his shoulder, watching the room correct itself without his help. And it was that stillness, more than anything Colt or Bradford said, that seemed to settle something in the neighbors watching him. A man who didn't need to defend himself, they seemed to decide collectively, was usually a man who didn't need to. Afterward, in the parking lot, a few neighbors approached Dean with the particular awkwardness of people who suddenly weren't sure how to address someone they thought they'd known. One offered a handshake that lasted a beat too long. Another simply nodded, the way people nod at something they respect but don't fully understand. Dean accepted all of it the same way he'd accepted everything else that summer, without ceremony, Daisy stirring sleepily against his shoulder as he carried her toward the truck. Russ caught up with him near the tailgate, voice low. Wasn't me who talked, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever got out, it wasn't from me on purpose. I know, Dean said. Wouldn't have mattered either way. Some things don't stay buried forever. Guess I'm all right with that now. Harper, seated 2 rows ahead, turned once during the vote to find Dean's eyes already on her, and neither looked away as quickly as either might have a month earlier. The fallout took its time arriving, the way these things usually did. Bradford lost the HOA presidency permanently at the next general election, replaced by Grace Whitfield in a landslide nobody bothered to contest. A closer look at the association's books, conducted by the neighborhood's volunteer legal counsel rather than by anything Dean had a hand in, turned up 2 years of questionable expenditures routed through Bradford's own construction company a discovery that brought a county auditor's letter to his mailbox not long after. Colt started showing up at Dean's place on weekends, hesitant at first, standing at the edge of the driveway like he wasn't sure he was allowed past it. He asked, eventually, if Dean might teach him something, anything, about how to actually be strong instead of just looking it. "I don't teach fighting," Dean told him, handing over a roofing hammer instead of an explanation. "But old Ray Delgado 2 streets over needs his roof patched before the next storm, and he served in Korea, and nobody's checked on him in a month. You want to be useful? That's where we start." Colt worked 3 Saturdays straight, hauling shingles, listening to Ray's stories on breaks, coming home each evening quieter and steadier than he'd been all summer, the swagger replaced by something that actually resembled effort. "Your dad ever ask what you were up to on Saturdays?" Ray asked him once, passing a thermos of sweet tea between shingle rows. "He doesn't ask much these days," Colt admitted. "I think he's got his own mess to sort out." "That's usually how it goes," Ray said. "Men like your father spend so long building things nobody can take from them, they forget to build the kind that can't be taken because nobody wants to." Colt didn't have an answer for that, but he thought about it the whole drive home, quieter than usual, staring out the truck window at the town going by. Harper came by on a Sunday with a pie balanced in one hand and a bottle of wine tucked under her arm, an excuse dressed up as a neighborly gesture that both of them understood for what it was. They stood in the backyard while the pie cooled on the porch rail, close enough now that the space between them held none of the careful distance from that first afternoon with the fallen maple branch. "Grace tells me the board's finally going to fix the streetlight on the corner," Harper said. "Small miracles. Franklin moves at its own pace," Dean said. "So do some people," Harper said. And there was enough in the way she said it that Dean looked at her a beat longer than the sentence required. Daisy came barreling out the back door before either of them could say more, hair still damp from a bath, insisting they both come look at a drawing she'd made of the 3 of them standing in front of the house, a sun with too many rays hanging crooked in one corner. She grabbed one of Dean's hands and one of Harper's without a second's hesitation, tugging them both toward the porch steps, entirely unaware of the significance in what she'd just done, or maybe understanding it better than either adult did. Neither Dean nor Harper pulled away. Late August settled over Larkspur Lane with the particular gold light that meant summer was ending, though nobody on the street seemed in any hurry about it. Dean sat on his porch steps, sleeves pushed up, watching Daisy race 2 neighborhood kids across the lawn, her laugh carrying farther than it had any right to. Colt was among them now, jogging alongside the younger kids instead of standing apart from them, occasionally letting Daisy win by a margin too obvious to be accidental. Harper sat beside Dean on the top step, close enough that her shoulder found his without either of them arranging it. Nobody mentioned the fire anymore. Nobody said the word that had once traveled through a group chat and a diner recorder and an old veteran's memory. There was no need. Trust, it turned out, hadn't required an announcement. It had simply built itself, quietly, in every moment neither of them had needed to explain. "You ever going to tell me the whole story?" Harper asked, not pushing, just leaving the door open the way she'd learned to over the past weeks. Dean watched Daisy cartwheel, badly, gloriously in the grass. "Someday," he said, "not because it's a secret anymore, just because some things are better told slow." "I can wait," Harper said, and meant it, in a way that made the waiting feel like its own kind of gift. Down in the yard, Colt scooped Daisy onto his shoulders for a lap around the oak tree, her arms thrown wide, shrieking with the particular joy of a kid being spun too fast on purpose. It was hard, watching them now, to remember the boy who'd once stood chest to chest with Dean on a stranger's lawn, finger jabbing the air, desperate to prove something to a father who'd never once told him he didn't need to. Some distances, it turned out, closed themselves quietly, given enough time and the right kind of patience. Grace Whitfield walked her dog past the house and lifted a hand in greeting, and Dean lifted his back, an easy gesture between neighbors that would have seemed impossible 3 months earlier when he was still just the fence guy and she was still just a name on a mailbox. Franklin had a way of sorting itself out eventually. He was learning, the way most true things did, without needing anyone to announce them first. She reached over and set her hand on his where it rested against the step. No announcement, no question needing an answer, just her hand covering his the way it might have covered it every evening for years, if either had let themselves imagine that far ahead. Dean didn't move his hand away. He turned it slightly, until her fingers settled into the space between his, and neither of them said anything else about it, because nothing else needed saying. Daisy's laughter rose again from the yard, bright against the fading light, and Dean watched her, then Harper, then let his eyes close for one unguarded second, something loosening in his chest that had been locked tight since long before Franklin, Tennessee, since long before a fence line or a fireworks show or a fist that never landed. He had spent years guarding a door no one was trying to open. Now someone had simply walked in, and he had let her.